And now I have great pleasure in welcoming back George Vassiadis, an early member of the Levant Heritage Foundation. And he's taught at Royal Holloway. He's now a Hellenist. He's written on Greek schools in Istanbul and occupied Istanbul. And now he's going to talk to us on the Greek used in Istanbul and Alexandria from 1870 to 1970. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Levantine Heritage Foundation for inviting me to speak today at the symposium, and all of you for braving the heat to come here. I've checked and it's hotter than Istanbul, Alexandria, and I'm going to begin by providing a brief historical outline of the Greek language, followed by some population statistics. So, from the 4th century BC onwards, the Greek language developed in 3 strands. The first strand is the Koine, Kimi in modern Greek, common form of the Greek language, spread by Alexander the Great's successors. It became the lingua franca of the Greco-Roman East, and is best known, of course, as the language of the New Testament. This strand continued to evolve as a spoken and written language, and by 1200 AD, it was already very similar to the Greek that's spoken today. Even though regional variations and dialects existed, they were almost always mutually intelligible. The spoken and written forms of this strand of Greek are called Romaica, or Roman, from the East Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire, where it was a majority language, and Demotiki, Demotic, which simply means language of the people. The second strand emerged during the Hellenistic period as a conservative, scholarly reaction to the continuing evolution of Koine. It was based on the grammatical and lexical forms of classical Athenian, Attic Greek, and it was used for over 1,000 years by Byzantine administrators, scholars, and theologians based in Constantinople and the provinces. This second strand survived the fall of Byzantium and remained the language of the patriarchates of the East, and it was also cultivated by the Phanarians, the Ottoman Greek elite of Istanbul. At the end of the 18th century, the spread of Enlightenment ideas led to discussions about what it meant to be Greek and what form of the language should be adopted as the national tongue. The educated classes favored the learned tradition of Constantinople. Another faction suggested resurrecting the pure Attic Greek of ancient Athens, and a third group advocated for Demotic. Yes, a compromise was suggested by a scholar, Adamantios Korais, who was born in Smyrna in 1743 and settled in Paris before the French Revolution. A true child of the Enlightenment, Korais utterly rejected the Byzantine and Ottoman legacies. He proposed that Demotic Greek should be adopted as the national language, but only after purging it of Turkish, Italian, Albanian, Vlach, and Slavic loan words, abolishing extreme dialectical features, and standardizing its morphology and syntax by using a simplified form of ancient Greek grammar. Korais' view won many influential supporters, especially after the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence in 1821. In the end, his proposal was not adopted, and a third strand of the Greek language emerged after his death in 1833. The Demotic Greek of the Peloponnese became the new national language by default, thanks to the fact that it was the largest and most populous province of the independent state created in 1830. But at the same time, Phanarians who had fled to Greece in large numbers after the outbreak of the War of Independence ensured that the learned tradition of Constantinople dominated intellectual discourse and education. Many of Korais' suggestions about grammar and his concept of purification were also put into effect, giving the composite idiom that emerged the name katharevousa, or the cleansed language. Thousands of new words conveying modern ideas in technical terms were coined using ancient Greek roots. The adoption of katharevousa as the official language of Greece was similar to how academic Parisian French and standardized Tuscan Italian became the national languages of France and Italy. Demotic continued to exist alongside katharevousa, and was used by the vast majority of Greeks in the home and in many aspects of their daily life. But its vocabulary and syntax were heavily influenced by katharevousa, especially in urban settings. The emergence of katharevousa was not universally welcomed. Proponents of Demotic criticized its artificiality and lack of uniformity, and blamed it for stifling literary creativity. In retrospect, the relatively small number of significant works of poetry and prose that appeared in Greece and the wider Greek world between the 1820s and the 1860s seem to back up this view. In the 1880s, the Demoticistes, or demodicists, launched a formal campaign against Katharevousa. In the early stages of the ensuing glossiko zitima, or language question, or struggle, the most influential demodicists were actually Greeks of the diaspora. At their head stood Yanis Sikaris, born in Odessa in 1854 and raised there and in Istanbul and Marseille, before studying Greek philology at the universities of Paris and Bonn. Sikaris' wife was the daughter of the eminent historian Ernest Renan, placing him at the epicenter of contemporary French intellectual life. In 1888, he published his manifesto To Taxidinu, My Journey. Supporters of Katharevousa throughout the Greek world were horrified by his use of words and grammatical forms derived from provincial dialects. His championing of phonetic spelling, which you can see here, struck them as illiterate and barbaric. As their stance became more intransigent, Sikaris gained more followers. The most prominent was his contemporary Alexandros Palis, a director of Raleigh Brothers in Liverpool. In 1901, when Palis's demotic translation of the New Testament appeared, riots broke out in the streets of Athens, claiming 8 lives. Palis was accused of blasphemy, debasing the Greek language, and promoting Pan-Slavism. Similar disorders followed in 1903, after a demotic version of Aeschylus's Oresteia was staged in Athens. By this time, the language question had acquired a divisive political dimension, which pitted the Orthodox Church and the conservative establishment against a growing coalition of liberals and modernizers. It's therefore somewhat ironic that when the Greek constitution was updated for the first time in almost half a century in 1911, during the premiership of the liberal modernizer Eleftheris Venizelos, Katharevousa was explicitly enshrined as the national language of Greece. Sikaris died in 1929, having spent decades teaching Greek at the University of Paris and agitating for Demotic to replace Katharevousa as the national language of Greece. A few years after his death, the use of Demotic was introduced into Greek primary schools, but the language issue continued to rumble on. It was only in 1975 that Katharevousa was completely abolished and Demotic became the official language of Greece. And now for a few population statistics. Before I give you these numbers, I'll caveat them with the statement that Ottoman population statistics have always been highly contentious. At the end of the 19th century, when the overall population of Istanbul stood at just over 1 million, it went down afterwards. There were an estimated 200,000 Greeks living in the city. The number continued to climb until it peaked somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 in 1922. In the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish War, the exchange of net populations, the number dropped precipitously to about 130,000 in 1927, and then to about 85,000 in 1947. The anti-Greek pogrom of 1955 and the expulsion of Greek nationals in 1964 had a catastrophic effect, and between then and now, the number of Greeks in Istanbul has collapsed to under 1,000 out of a total population of 16 million. At the end of the 19th century, there are about 30,000 Greeks in Alexandria out of a total population of over 300,000. Emigration increased exponentially after the imposition of the British Protectorate in 1882, and the number of Greeks in Alexandria peaked at about 50,000 in 1927, out of a total population by then of 600,000. The changing political situation in Egypt, and in particular the gradual abolition of privileges extended to foreign communities, contributed to a gradual drop in numbers. But during the 30s and 40s, the number remained static at about 35,000. Despite the common misconception that the Greeks were expelled from Egypt after the 1956 Suez War, it was rather economic and cultural reasons that contributed to their departure. By 1963, only 12,000 Greeks remained in Alexandria. Today there are a few hundred, out of a total population of 6 million. To provide some wider Greek context, at the end of the 19th century, the combined population of Athens and its nearby port of Piraeus totaled 175,000. It was only around 1920 that the combined population of Athens and Piraeus, which then reached about 453,000, surpassed the Greek population of Istanbul. The language of the liturgies held in the more than 100 Greek Orthodox churches of Istanbul, which are all still in existence, and the dozen or so Greek Orthodox churches of Alexandria, has been static for over 500 years. Even today, church services are centered around selections from the Old and New Testaments, in the same Hellenistic and Greco-Roman koine in which they were first recorded. The remainder of the liturgy is made up of prayers, chants, and poetry, and various registers of the learned tradition of Greek, dated from between the 4th century AD and the late Byzantine period, composed in Constantinople, Asia Minor, and the monasteries of the Near East and North Africa. Even the concluding sermon was until recently delivered in Greek of the learned tradition. On the other hand, what one might describe as the working language of the Greek Orthodox Church in Istanbul and Alexandria inevitably came under the influence of Kathoreousa. This was the case with the language taught in Greek Orthodox seminaries in both cities and used in the church's courts and administrative offices, where property disputes, inheritances, and divorces were adjudicated and charity administered. Even today, the baptismal marriage and other certificates issued by the Patriarchates of Constantinople and Alexandria are composed in simple Kathoreousa. The modern city of Alexandria materialized during the early to mid-19th century, and in that early period, Greek and Italian were the most common languages of commerce. It was only during the second half of the 19th century that French supplanted both, joined by English in the decades after 1882 in Alexandria, and Arabic after World War II. In Constantinople, the situation was similar, with French being the preferred language of commerce from the mid-19th century to the 1920s, after which it was gradually replaced with Turkish. Despite the dominance of French, in both cities, Greek continued to be used in commercial settings, whether it was in the headquarters or back rooms of the banks and money changers of the Galata district of Istanbul, or the offices and warehouses of the cotton traders of Alexandria. It was also used and to be heard in the headquarters of import-export firms and in the countless Greek-owned grocery stores, shops, cafes, bars, and restaurants in both cities. The Greek encounter would have been demotic, including regional permutations and the standardized speech of urban dwellers, depending in each case on the place of origin and the level of education of the individuals in question. As business correspondence was normally left to educated secretaries, it was almost always in simple Kathoreousa. Greek spoken in the private homes of Istanbul and Alexandria was similar to that encountered in the workplace. Various registers of demotic ranging from standardized Constantinopolitan and Athenian dialects to dialects from the Greek mainland, the Aegean Islands, and Asia Minor, with much depending on the background and educational level of the speakers. The first generation of children born and brought up in Alexandria and Istanbul would have been exposed to the accents of their parents' place of origin and home. But as soon as they started going to school, they were educated in standardized Greek and Kathoreousa, and even if they did not continue their schooling beyond the primary level, as was common, in most cases this is the language they would use for the rest of their lives, both speaking and writing. Although the educational system of the Byzantine period came to an abrupt end with the Ottoman conquest, it is believed that the Patriarchate of Constantinople established a new school for boys as early as 1453. This was the forerunner of the Megalithic Skoli, Great School of the Nation, which gradually evolved into one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the Greek world. Over the course of the next 3 centuries, more schools appeared in Istanbul and its suburbs, all of which were funded by private individuals. By the middle of the 19th century, most of the 50-odd Greek kinotites, communities spread across Istanbul, had a school for boys, and in a few cases for girls as well, administered by committees made up of prosperous local inhabitants who were responsible for raising funds, setting curricula, and recruiting teachers. The Ottoman Tanzimat, or Program of Reorganization, which was rolled out after 1839 with the aim of modernizing the empire, made no changes to the funding or administrative structures of the schools of the non-Muslim minorities. From that time onwards, the main intervention of the government came in the form of close supervision of school curricula and texts aimed at weeding out any content that could be viewed as seditious. Censorship aside, the period between 1839 and 1908 was marked by a remarkable flourishing of Greek education in Istanbul. Many of the existing boys' schools were significantly upgraded, and several new girls' schools were established. Although tuition fees were charged, poor or otherwise deserving pupils were allowed to attend at reduced rates or for free. There were also numerous private schools. Of the many Greek schools that were established or reorganized after 1870 in Istanbul, I will mention three. Vassiadis School for Girls in Para, opened in 1875, the Megalith School and the Fanar, rebuilt in 1881, and the Zografion School for Boys in Para, rebuilt in 1892. All three are still in existence today, albeit with a handful of students. The Greek educational history of Alexandria closely reflects that of Istanbul. Schools are founded and maintained by the community without direct governmental involvement in funding or curricula. This state of affairs continued unchanged after the British control in 1882 and has continued to the present day. As the modern city of Alexandria did not exist until the 19th century, there are no venerable schools there. The Tositsea Skoli for boys was established in 1854, and the nearby Averofion School for girls opened in 1896. In the early 20th century, to accommodate the growing Greek population, a campus comprising several schools and playing fields was created in the suburb of Shakti. A number of Greek primary schools were also established in the eastern suburbs where many Greeks lived. As in Istanbul, there are quite a few private schools. Today, the only functioning Greek school in Alexandria is one located on the Shakti campus. Between 1870 and 1970, Katharevousa was the language of instruction in the community and private schools in Istanbul and Alexandria. It was only during the 1930s, in accordance with developments in Greece, that Demotic replaced Katharevousa at the primary school level. Curricula and teaching materials came from Greece or were heavily influenced by Athenian models. Many teachers who taught the community schools are educated in Greece or at the highly regarded Greek teachers' colleges in Istanbul. Moreover, during the 20th century, diplomas handed out by the principal boys and girls secondary schools of both Istanbul and Alexandria were recognized as equivalent to those delivered in Greece, and no special exams were required to enter the universities of Athens or Thessaloniki. Until recently, graduates of the boys and girls secondary schools of both Istanbul and Alexandria were renowned, and this is in Greece, for the elegance of their spoken and written Greek. Greek newspapers and periodicals, as we've heard, began to appear in the Ottoman Empire quite early, and also in the diaspora, well before the creation of the Greek state in 1830. After independence, the number of Greek newspapers grew at an astonishing pace to satisfy the huge thirst for domestic and international news. This phenomenon was also reflected outside Greece. In Istanbul, a total of 133 newspapers, some ephemeral and others long-lived, were published between 1842 and today. And these are some examples. The Apoyev Matini, which is still in publication, is actually the second oldest newspaper in Istanbul after Cumhuriyet. In Alexandria, where the first newspaper appeared in 1862, the number runs to several dozen. A wide variety of periodicals was also published from the 1840s onwards in both cities. The language of all serious newspapers was Katharevousa, which in a few cases, especially in Istanbul, reflected the influence of the Constantinopolitan learned tradition. On the other hand, simple Katharevousa and Demotic began appearing in some Istanbul and Alexandria periodicals during the early 20th century, especially in satirical and children's magazines. It was only after the formal adoption of Demotic as the official language of Greece in 1975 that Katharevousa disappeared altogether from print media. Greeks in Istanbul and Alexandria never became, Greek in Istanbul and Alexandria never became a widely used lingua franca, like it did in Smyrna. Intermarriage between Greeks and Western Europeans was much more frequent in Smyrna, and the ubiquitous presence of Greek servants meant that entire households often spoke the kitchen Greek, frequently referred to in Levantine memoirs. This phenomenon was much more limited in Istanbul and Alexandria, although many non-Greeks understood and spoke the language, including Turco-Cretans, Albanians, Slavo-Macedonians, Vlachs, Bulgarians, and Arab street vendors. Furthermore, some Turks in Istanbul were fluent in Greek, especially in government offices dealing with translation and censorship. It was also included in the curriculum of the prestigious Galatasaray Lycée in Pera. And Kemal Atatürk was also, Greek people said that he understood Greek perfectly, but he never spoke out of political reasons. In the literary world now, after the flight of the Phanarians from Istanbul, they were succeeded in the hierarchy of the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Ottoman administration by a new group of Greek speakers with origins all over the empire. These neo-Phanariots were joined by an emergent middle class of merchants, financiers, physicians, and lawyers in managing the educational and social institutions of the Greek community. They continued to foster the learned strand of the Greek language and also made use of extremely sophisticated forms of kathareousa. But instead of generating original literary works, emphasis was placed on the study of ancient Greek classics and the composition of philological and scientific studies influenced by Western European models. The foremost representative of this trend was the Greek Philological Syllabus of Constantinople, which was established in 1861 and soon developed into a sort of combined Academy of Arts and Sciences and an unofficial Ministry of Education of the Ottoman Greeks. The syllabus remained faithful to kathareousa throughout its 60-year existence, but it did not ignore the existence of demotic, and one of its most significant projects was the systematic collection of words and phrases with ancient Greek roots that still featured in the contemporary spoken language. And my most recent article is about what happened to the Greek philological syllabus during the Allied occupation of Greece and why it was closed down by the Republican authorities in 1923. And there's a flyer at the back for the link to the book where that is a chapter. There are many other studies in that book which are of extreme interest about the Allied occupation of Istanbul. Pro-Demotic movement fronted by Ethnicity also found supporters in Istanbul. In 1895, a small group of men and women with literary inclinations took over an existing periodical called Philologiki Icho, which we saw there, far right. Which is literary echo in English, and turned it into a vehicle for their own work and other writers of the modern. Although short-lived, Philologiki Icho broke new ground as it was the first periodical in the Greek world to champion demotic as a literary language. The leading proponent of demotic in Istanbul was the eminent physician Vassiadis, who was born in the city in 1849 and died in 1936. He confirmed his credentials as a demoticist in 1899 when he rose to the defense of Alexandria Papadopoulou, a teacher and writer connected to the periodical Philologiki Icho. After one of her short stories was criticized in the press for being vulgar, using a vulgar language, Vassiadis published a long series of letters in defense of demotic in a more open-minded paper, which was also for kathareousa, of course. 3 years later, he republished letters with an extensive introduction in a book entitled To Glossikon Zitima Kie Pedeftikimas Anagenesis, The Language Question and Our Educational Renaissance, in which he called for a complete revision of the Greek educational system and new school texts in demotic. Vassiadis and other leading demoticists in Istanbul further promoted the movement by holding weekly literary salons and staging public events. I'm coming to the end. Over the next decade, a small but extremely influential number of poets and writers emerged in Istanbul, many of whom combined their literary endeavors with full-time jobs as teachers and employees. For teachers, openly declaring their demotic credentials was risky, given the influence of kathareousa, and most crucially, the fact that the committees who managed the schools of the Greek community were all dominated by supporters of kathareousa. Inevitably, in 1911, a controversy erupted in Pera when some local school teachers were accused of spreading demonic propaganda. The teachers were ultimately sacked, but not before the issue had taken on divisive political dimensions. After 1912, military coups in both Greece and the Ottoman Empire, and more than a decade of constant warfare, relegated the language question very much to the background in both Greece and the Ottoman Empire. By contrast, it was exactly at this point that it began to deliver encouraging results in Alexandria. There, demotic was cultivated by a similar demographic to Istanbul, namely individuals with careers in other fields who had literary inclinations and wanted to promote creativity. They had established a periodical called Nea Zoe, New Life, in 1904. At first it was published in simple kathareousa, but gradually more content in demotic appeared and contributions poured in from Athens. In 1911, a disagreement amongst the editorial team led to the creation of a new periodical called the Grammata, Letters. Although Neazoe, which means new life, and Grammata, Letters, never enjoyed large circulation numbers and invariably ran at a loss. They were renowned for the quality and originality of the poetry and prose they published, and for the literary cliques formed around them. Indeed, it is now widely acknowledged in Greece that during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the most important center of Greek literature was Alexandria, not Athens. One of the regular contributors to both Neazoe and the Grammata was the poet Constantinos Constantine Kavafi. Born in Alexandria in 1863, he spent most of his life in the city, working as a mid-range civil servant. Although he was older than most of the poets and writers who dominated the local literary circles, he was to prove the most original and groundbreaking of them all. Kavafi never published a collection of his poetry in book form during his lifetime, but nevertheless managed to attract influential admirers in both his home city and abroad, so that even before his death in 1933, he was recognized as a poet of international standing. It is fitting to end this discussion of the Greek of Istanbul and Alexandria with Kavafi, for he was a true product of both cities, in that his parents were Constantinopolitan Greeks who had made Alexandria their home, like my great-grandparents. Moreover, between the ages of 19 and 22, he lived in Istanbul, and his time there is thought to have been crucial to his literary development. It is therefore no surprise that the Greek of his poetry, which is demotic, as far as his grammar and syntax is concerned, nevertheless includes numerous lexical nods to the learned tradition of Constantinopolitan Kavarevusa. His manner of speaking is said to be similar. The language of Kavafi's poetry and his conversation can be described as a new Alexandrine koine, bringing together the 3 historical strands of Greek discussed in this paper. Although Greek is on the verge of disappearing in 2 of its oldest homes, it will live on in their names, naming Istanbul, which is derived from the phrase Istanbuli, to the city, and Iskandaria, the Arabic approximation of Alexandria. The Greek language has evolved in both Istanbul and Alexandria, also lives on in Greece and the Greek diaspora. The uprooting of speakers of Constantinopolitan Greek began in the 1820s when the Phanariots were obliged to flee their homeland. It continued during the 20th century when tens of thousands of Constantinopolitan Greeks were forced to leave their native city. This second wave of migrants from Istanbul included many individuals who settled in Athens and figured prominently amongst the Geniata Triantha, the generation of the 1930s, the group of writers who profoundly influenced the subsequent development of Greek literary life. A third, but smaller wave of migrants was that from Egypt, which started as a trickle in the 1930s and became a flood by the 1960s. Amongst them were many thousands of Alexandrine Greeks who took with them the elegant and idiosyncratic Greek typified by the poetry of Constantine Kavafi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. It almost brought tears to my eyes, the death of Greek in Alexandria and Constantinople. Now, good all our speakers. Now, we have any questions now arising from our talks? I have a question for Maureen. The purification of, quote, purification, unquote, of Turkish. It's so similar to what was happening in Greek.
Yes.
And
Greek said it first.
French and Italian as well.
Is there any evidence that Kamal was influenced by Greek or other languages?
I don't have the evidence, but it makes perfect sense. He was
Yes.
always studying what was going on in Europe,
Yes.
and it would have been Greece as well. But he didn't want the 2 languages. He didn't want to do the old whatever you say. He didn't want to have that.
If you want to purify language. Yeah, because he said they researched traditional Turkish words.
Yeah.
And that's very
Which were traditional Turkish words were usually invented yesterday, weren't they? The ones they added into the language.
no other.
Somewhere, and somewhere, that was a big mishmash. Yeah.
Yes, Quentin.
Yes, in the schools, whether they were sort of Greek or Turkish, what was the second language typically taught?
Well, you can answer it For the Greek schools, I can answer for the other ones. Yeah.
Greek until the 1908 revolution in the Ottoman Empire, when the Young Turks came to power and passed laws saying that Turkish also had to be taught as a second language in the minority schools. So Greek mainly, and then Turkish added after 1908, and then after, of course, the advent of Republican Turkey, Turkish had to be, I mean, the number of hours was constantly increased until it was 50-50 or even 60-40.
But in the 19th century, what would it be the second language?
Yes, French to a certain degree. Some private schools taught Turkish in an early date in the 19th century as well. You know, commercial schools where they realized that people had to be bilingual or trilingual to succeed.
In the 19th century, in Constantinople, we'll call it that for that time, it was very difficult. I mean, there were a few Ottoman children who went to foreign schools, but the Sultan didn't want it, and they had to leave. So the language would be in the particular sphere of it. So you had British and American, you had Italian, you had Austrian, you had German, and French more than any others. So they would just teach and that would be it.
And all Greeks also objected to their children going to Catholic schools, although it was very common that thousands went. They were afraid of proselytization, not so much the languages, it was the proselytization they were afraid of.
So in Robert College, at the very, very beginning, it was mostly Armenian boys, but the Armenian patriarchy was furious and didn't want them. So it ended up being the poorer boys, and that's why he started all of those little factories whereby he accidentally got the attention of Robert, who then became the founder of and there were a lot of Bulgarians, extraordinary number of Bulgarians who went to Robert College, but mostly minorities until 1908. I think that's when father children something like that.
And in Egypt, there were compulsory Arabic classes from about 1947 or 48. And many people that I met deeply resented them, but they still had to go to the bases pretending to learn Arabic.
Galatasaray, which was the most prestigious establishment school, that was taught in French,
I think the main language was, probably the main language of instruction was French, but then Ottoman, Greek, Latin, Persian, all the languages were later abolished.
Yeah. And Arabic and Farsi are now taught in Turkish schools again, for now set of reasons.
Not universally taught, are they?
They probably taught at universities.
Universally, sorry.
Not universally, no, but it was one of the first things Alexandria did was take those languages out of schools. And then somebody else was named for mention, brought them back in more recently.
Any more questions? Yes?
For Mr. Vassiadis, Dr. Vassiadis, you mentioned the irony of the new constitution at the beginning of the 20th century being Catharevous and then under the administration of Venizelos. Why? Was that just too big a step to take to put a new constitution in the democratic?
Probably. I mean, he was a very clever politician. We didn't want to rock the boat too much. It was under his influence that there was a short-lived reform in the 1920s until he was thrown out of office, where they did introduce democracy in the schools, but it was withdrawn immediately as soon as he was out of power. But if you look at his writing, he did translations of the ancient Greek writers, and if you look at his private letters, it's Catharevous that he used, because he was educated in that, and that was his language, the language he thought in. So he wasn't really an extreme demonicist like Sikaris or Pallas. He would have probably been shocked by their forms of Greek. So it was expediency, but maybe also personal preference.
Any more questions? Yes?
I'm intrigued by the number of newspapers that were generated in the 19th century. And I was just wondering whether you have any information about how they were consumed. So in a typical household, did they take their first language paper? Did they take a French paper? Did they take a Greek paper? Is there any evidence where you can match, let's say, the distribution or the circulation of a paper to the size of the community to get an indication of how they were consumed?
From what we can see, French and Greek language were the... So, in the case of Greek, it makes sense that there is this proportionality of Greek language, Greek community. In the case of French, it's clear that because French was the common language, the lingua franca of much more communities of Izmir in this case. So, I guess, French language was read by almost everybody, and probably each community would choose, maybe there will be even competitors with your newspaper in the French language, so one be politically or even not necessarily, one was more like trade, maybe more trade news, one more domestic news, more international. But the other ones will be more each one for each community. Armenian, for sure. No, especially Armenian language, nobody would read. It was not a lingua franca. While Greek, in a minor way, we can
more spoken.
Yeah, more spoken, more, especially in Smyrna, where we had this Smyrna as a language that was a second lingua franca, kind of a second lingua franca. In the other case, as you see, even English was rather downsized. Compared to, not that much compared to the community, but compared to the idea that we may have of English now as an international language. It's clear that at that time, it was the language of the community, it was not the language as now we are here all speaking English. It was French, it was definitely French. So, yeah, I would say that.
As Miguel, as you said in your talk, even within each language, there were lots of newspapers that served a certain political, shall we say, opinion or faction. So the Greeks, one would have been pro-Venizelos, one would have been pro-the-monarchy, one would have been pro-Catharevousa, pro-the-monarchy. It also depends on that. That's the one you would choose to have at home, the one that fitted your outlook.
Especially after landing away for what concerns the political views, when the political life went much more light.
I have a very vivid memory of Naxos just before Hajjam came in. The newspapers, many newspapers would come in here, and the restaurant we used to go to was right next to the news agent. And it seemed to be all men in the main town would go and buy their own newspaper, and then they would go to the cafeteria, and they would argue with each other. So I'm just wondering how these were consumed. Were they newspapers consumed at home, or did they take them to the cafeteria and have big arguments with somebody else with a different newspaper? I don't know. It's my wish.
Yeah.
I think in Alexandria and Istanbul they actually worked a bit harder than they did in Naxos, let's put it that way. So there wasn't that much time to sit in the cafe. They would have, but there wasn't as much time to sit in that.
Really? Okay.
Okay. But they did.
Okay. They argued.
We know from the literature.
Could I ask a question about the person, the man who rescued from martyrdom?
Yeah, very difficult. Sorry, let's talk in Nicholas.
Yeah, because I thought about, I'm a bit obsessed about what happens to the Greeks, the Anatolian Greeks, who end up in Greece and seem to have been much hated. Of course, they seem to have been much hated. I mean, there was the privileged ones who had some money and a lot of education, and then there were all the others. So, are you going to follow that part of the story for this family? How did they negotiate the kind of prejudice that I still hear in families 2 generations, 3 generations later?
Now in Greece,
Yeah.
regarding the families coming from Anatolia.
From that moment, from before 1922. Also, does anybody remember the date of the fire in Smyrna? What was the date?
13.
13.
Wednesday, 13.
So you're Brazilian. You're Brazilian. Left a week before that, yeah?
Yes. But even Nicholas was killed together with Chrysostomus before the fire, because the troops entered Saturday morning,
Okay.
the 9th,
Yeah, okay.
and the fire starts on the 13th.
But you were the son of the Don Martyr left even before that.
Yeah, probably less on the 8th, or
Yeah.
7th, on the 8th. Yeah, because I think after the troops started, there were no ships.
There were, but you hadn't had the right kind of passport or a fictitious,
Brazilian consulate.
the Brazilian solution.
Yeah, I noticed that the signature on that document, the Brazilian consul, he might have been an honorary consul or a vice consul. That's why he's not captured in the records. There was definitely, I'm sure, a Brazilian consul because there was an Alexandria.
Yeah.
It was the name on that signature. He wasn't a Brazilian in Alexandria. He was Lebanese. And his signature on
Andrea. I can read Andrea, not read the surname.
Iliadis. It's a Greek surname, very well known in Smyrna.
You can read it?
Yeah. And Andreas Iliadis. That's spelled E-L-L-I-A.
So he was a Greek honorary consul, probably.
Well, he was a Greek who was a businessman of some kind who probably imported and exported goods from Brazil, and that's why he was the Brazilian consul, honorary consul.
Luckily, a friend of the family.
But they were just going out all the way through the fire. Yeah. For some. Yeah. But they just weren't taking care of.
They were not
They were not taking care of those.
because until they have to collect all the troops. First of all, the priority for Greece.
Don't excuse them.
No, they took
The priority was to save the troops because the troops were Greek citizens. So the issue.
Oh no, we're talking about Allied warships that were in the
All the
fire,
other countries, yeah.
during the fire. Yeah, you know more. You know everything about
They
this.
did nothing until
Yeah, it's like disgraceful.
the cruises, they said, forced the officers to take some refugees on board. But another question for Miguel. Can you tell us more, or did you find more anti-nationalist Greeks and Turks, like you described? Very interesting figures in the newspapers.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name. Zikaru and
True.
Which actually I also been trying to understand what's the meaning of this term.
True.
According to a friend of mine, true is maybe it was the one who fixes a broken.
But there were many
Yeah.
Muslim Turkish opponents of Kemal in Islam.
Yep.
Sorry, there were
Many Muslim Turkish opponents of Kemal in Islam.
And many in Constantinople.
Especially yeah. But also it's weird because even after we get Republic, then there is this party that is there is a small interval when Mustafa Kemal allows for a multi-party system in Turkey. I think it's
2 minutes.
Yeah, like, and there is an election, and this kind of anti-Kemalist party. I mean, the majority of votes gets from Smyrna. So Smyrna always had this anti-authoritarian, if you want. So there was liberal, liberal, trade vocation. So somehow far away from the state, they didn't feel. I think they felt Kemal with the Republic as a very strong form of, again, a state imposing rules. Why in a city of trade, tradesmen just want minimum rules, minimum positions.
What happens in Izmir after the fire? I mean, that would be a different story. Who is left? And then, of course, a lot of people are resettled there. It's basically resettled, right?
Yeah.
Generally, when I meet people from Izmir, they know next to nothing about the history of the city. And most of the people I meet are displaced.
You mean
Family.
Muslims that came to Izmir from different places?
Yes.
Yes, apart from Jordan, you mentioned Ardeen. Any other if you have come across Albanian sort of spoken or Albanian societies or contribution made in the Mediterranean, they live in many different cities, and certainly they help the forming of the Albanian state sort of later on.
I went to school in Albania, I mean, Albania was counted in that census, in that first census.
Right.
But Albanian was, when I asked my friends, when they would finally tell me about their family histories, there are many Albanians who enter the Ottoman system, so are part of the Ottoman nation.
And Albanian had the alphabet issue because some Albanians wanted a Latin alphabet and some wanted an Ottoman Arabic alphabet.
That was a very important element in Ottoman culture, I would say.
Georgia?
I'm quite curious, there's a passing reference when you were talking about Vassiadis, excuse me, terrible. And then this woman, Alexandria Papadopoulou, who dared write something vulgar, which brings up two things. First, obviously, there was a colossal elite, middle class, street language, to what extent that was. And what is it that she did? First of all, she was a woman, so that's why it's most so what was it that she did, said, and wrote?
They used
so shocking.
vulgar was the word hideos, which is, it's not vulgar in the sense of rude or obscene, but vulgar in the sense of very common, like street.
Right, so what was it, what did she?
She wrote a short story where she used some demotic words, it's as simple as that.
Oh really?
Yeah,
So it's not a subject
or with the vocabulary is a demotic word that wasn't in Catharevousa, or she used a verb form that was demotic. It was something very basic. And the original criticism came from in the newspaper where her story was published.
Right.
There was a short paragraph, it was a very short story, a few columns in the newspaper, and the editor said, we're publishing this story which is very worthy of publication, very original, but we do have to point out that it includes words that some might think is vulgar. And because he had to as a newspaper publisher in those days to sort of cover his back. But it wasn't anything rude, it was a very sweet short story about a family that was suffering. And then a friend of hers wrote a very acidic letter to the press saying, defending her, and that's when Vassiadis waded in to try and calm things.
And did she write anything else?
Oh yes, she's actually now viewed as one of the most important prose writers in Greek. Women, there were others before her, a few, a handful, but she's been resurrected from oblivion.
Now, as a long push before we have a drink or two, would George Galdis like to come and tell us a few words about another language which we've touched upon, the Romaica or Smanaica, the language of
As I was having a refreshment, I've been thinking about you guys suffering. I decided best to give you a little sample is to read a little passage from our Spanaica lexicon book. And there's a chapter which is all about conversations in Spanaica language, which is Romaica. Except Romaica was more in Istanbul, Constantinople, whereas Spanaica was a many pastiche of various languages. And how did we get that? We got that because of the greater mix of nationalities in Smyrna than there were in Constantinople. And rather than fighting languages, our ancestors decided that they would use them all as convenient as it would be. So there is a certain Marco who says in our Spanaica accent as well, similar perdi, pequeño files, livo sergani prostiga. Now you will notice that there are foreign words again, the ga being the railway station, and and they are very living, of course, the afternoon. Που είναι τα όμορφα εγγλέζικα σπίτια, εγγλέζικα meaning αγγλικά in Greek, proper Greek, εγγλέζικα in our language. Και πιο κάτι καρσί, καρσί being a Turkish word, karşı, που είδουσε κάτι φάμπρικες meaning factories. Ο Σαμπέρ, ο φίλος της Μαρίκας της Λεβαντίνας, έκανε ένα σάρτλ, μια λέσχη, τρίσικ, πολύ νόστιμη, με τένις και χαβούζα. Χαβούζα είναι another Turkish word, meaning experience. Μας κεράσανε τσιτσιμπίρια being ginger beer, και καφέ, και τσάι με γλυκά. Μα θέλω να γίνω μόνο μέλος και εγώ για το γυρισμό, which is the return. Όπως είμαστε κουρασμένες, πήραμε καρότσα being the horse with the carriages, yes. Καρότσα που μου έφερε μέχρι εδώ στο Πικεφί. Στο Πικεφί is an old fashioned already to me. So Picaffi was as and when, and so on and so forth. And then I think it gives a little taste of the mix of languages.
And it's a completely different attitude to language, not state-imposed or purified or government, just human.
It's funny because it reminds me when I was Monsieur Dupont in Vassiadis, there was a passage in made up Latin.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that? Which was more picking up all the old Latin words and some Spanish words. But for us in Smyrna, it was picking up Western
Do you ever hear this in Izmir?
yeah, last books will make sometime this week or last week. But the funny thing is that my brother who lives next door to me, we never seem to be speaking our language, even if members of the family to understand us. We'd rather whisper and speak in English. However, speaking amongst Smyrnians was very common when not wanting to be understood by Turks, I mean Ottoman Turks, or by foreigners that had just arrived, expatriates. And then you would have key words that denoted when we refer to them. For instance, we would say Levant. Do they use it in Greece, Levant?
Yeah. And this not wanting to be understood is, of course, we think of language as meaning, but language also is high.
Yes.
And the great French statesman Talleyrand said, words are given to us to hide our meaning.
What about local dialects? That's the thing you're finding. I mean, Europe people speak or English doesn't tend to use it to not be.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of local dialects and all that.
But in my boyfriend's family, when I was growing up, it was Ladino, French, Turkish with ears. But it was what I heard most often when I was at that house was Badilon, which is the same thing.
And of course, we did have a bit of Latin injected because we had a very nice Jewish community.
Yeah.
that spoke Ladino.
Yeah.
And so we would pick up words and expressions.
And there's so much Turkish in Latino in a lovely way, the same way that you have.
Yes, yes, oh yes, there will be.
I'm listening to the book by, what is he, he's not, well, he's a Bosnian writer, Alexandria, but the hero is supported Jewish in Sarajevo. And he keeps on referring to people as ellipses.
And they see people
So, and also even when there was the 1964, I remember very, very well, and there's all this politics of language, but anytime I was out with friends and languages, the conversation would start in one sentence in one language and would go somewhere else.
this is
It was like,
yes. I was speaking to my friend when after an interview yesterday, his birthday, and we must have, between us, we must have spoken about at least 4 languages.
without noticing.
Coming in, whichever words come to mind.
Which also happens to be a route between English, French, and Arabic. There's a question over here.
Yes, a question for the speaker. You said about the Turkish language with the purifying process.
Yeah.
Obviously, eliminated many words in Arabic, Persian, and many other languages.
Yeah.
How were they substituted? What kind of Turkish words?
It's in many different ways, using those words that they have gathered together and then making the grammar more regular. So they use root nouns and then just figure out what else they could add to them and so on. But so many of the words I grew up with in the 1960s, nobody understands them anymore.
No, I was curious if, for example, they were taking words from a specific Turkish dialect, from a specific area.
It was really, the engineers were in charge.
Okay.
There was one word that had come up quite often. It was the uğursuzis. Uğursuzis comes from uğursuz in Turkish. But it does not necessarily, I think it comes from the Sparta region, where the Greeks spoke Turkish.
But they just mixed it. Because they gathered up these words over 2 years, and then they submitted them, and then this committee decided which ones they liked. And certain words they weren't able to remove from the vocabulary. One of my favorite words is mesela.
Yes, of course.
And it's such a their name is what they want us to say. I don't want to say it. And so, the way, and also, I don't know, when I go to Istanbul now, and I listen to school children coming out of their lycees, they have the most wonderful new slang, which they always say that you can tell they're speaking below the radar. They're carrying on their own language, and the slang is always changing. Language can't be controlled beyond a certain
Like all generations.
The other words that are extinct now, because I'm seeing that with French, they still do it, they purify their language. And my French father used to like, he said, English is vicious, because it's not purified. And I've got ancient dictionary of languages and words in there that I have no idea. I mean, you don't hear them, so I was wondering with the Turkish purification, you come across other words that families but just never use, so if you say it now, Turkish person would know.
Efforts to bring old words, beautiful old words
back.
But
back from extinction.
I remember interviewing 20 years ago one of the big language people from Korea, and he showed me the dictionary for Turkish in the beginning. So it was thick, and then it just gets thinner.
Another question? Yes, the language that we spoke today, would you say most of them, grammatical rules and alphabets, they were formed after the dissolution of Ottoman Empire? And then they would have been spoken differently and written differently, let's say in the 17th century, or early 18th century, or 16th century?
Grammar is a different question. I mean, a lot of the times when people are talking about this, they're looking at the I know that grammar was fixed or standardized. A lot of rules from Persian and Arabic come in and they've got removed. But there's something really extraordinary about Turkish grammar. The way that a thought is put together, which is so different from the other languages of language. So I don't think they've ever, I think there's part of it that seems to not be affected even by the invasion of English. So there's something. I would say generally, it would be nice if we talked about it, not just words, talking about it.
Languages.
Yeah.
It was a language of gesture. What did
Oh,
that
yeah. Oh.
That with your eyes.
Well, that's because I grew up in Istanbul, they don't know what to do with me at my university because I'm always.
One last question.
There's a question on the chat as well.
Yeah.
There's one on there as well.
Oh, is this someone up there?
It may have been addressed, but it's a question for George. Thank you for your knowledge of cosmopolitan and Alexandrian and various questions of language.
For the Smyrna, which one?
Yes.
But then it says, great, my questions were answered.
Yeah.
15 minutes later.
Nice knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
After, your ritual with his, let's say, more diversified view of, keeping the community cohesion, or Kavafis, or, on the Turkish side, we haven't mentioned all those people who were against purification of languages. They were, of course, it's so sad that they were ahead of their time when they were living. They're appreciated now. Of course, now in UK we have all this diversity week, so we appreciate it now. But they never got appreciated once they were alive. Now we are trying to bring them, give them. But another lovely anecdote. This year in the French GCSEs, there is one final question. There is a very difficult bonus word, and if you know it, you get extra points. And all the Turkish kids get it right because the word was camionet. And my daughter was like, we got it all right. Like all the other English kids, we never heard this little truck. So, it's like how you can't really purify iskele or pul, these are very Turkish words, but they are so not Turkish.
But what I didn't have time to look at is that, because I guess it's specific, is the debate about Turkish and the artistic use of language is just going on still. So many, talk about he was dismissed as a reactionary, and now he's back in his place. Yeah, and Tammy Stockman as well is coming back. Yeah. So, and then we have the ones who really embraced, those traditional knowledge, and some of them have done really wonderful things with this idea. So that I think it's the debate about languages that's keeping it alive. And there, so many of the best writers are always in and out of jail because of what they're saying and how they're saying it. So, it is a really interesting tradition.
Well, on that note, I think we must give another round of applause to our guests. And see you next year, hopefully, at another conference on languages of the Levant, including French. I once asked an old lady of Istanbul, Leila Duran, what was it like Istanbul before 1914? And she replied, it was all French. Everybody spoke French.
Well, thank you for that. This is, just the first gathering about languages in the Levant. Of course, there's so much more we could say, and we shall. So just, watch this space, and please join us and our wonderful speakers for a glass of wine. Thank you.